Story 1. The Circulating Nurse's Phantom Prep. I found the Mayo stand already draped that morning, positioned exactly where I would have placed it. The instruments gleamed under the surgical lights in perfect arrangement, the 10-blade closest, hemostats fanned precisely as I always did. My initials were already logged in the room prep checklist, dated 3 hours before I'd even entered the building. The ink was still wet. I have worked as a circulating nurse in Operating Room 7 for 9 years. The hospital employs me on the morning shift, which begins at 5:30. I arrive at 5:15 to review the day's schedule, check equipment, and prepare the surgical field according to the attending surgeon's preferences. This routine has remained unchanged since my orientation. On the morning of October 4th, I entered OR 7 at 5:17 to prepare for a scheduled cholecystectomy. The procedure was listed for 7 o'clock. Dr. Brennan was the attending. I had worked with him 43 times prior. The room was already prepared. The surgical drapes covered the operating table in the configuration I typically use. The instrument trays sat open on the Mayo stand, arranged in the exact sequence I had developed over years of practice. The suction canisters were connected and tested. The electrocautery pencil lay at the precise angle I prefer, with the cord looped once to prevent tangling. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, assuming another nurse had been assigned to assist with early setup. I checked the staffing board outside the OR suite. My name appeared as the sole circulating nurse for OR 7. No additional staff were listed. I returned to the room and examined the setup more carefully. Everything was positioned correctly, down to the placement of the patient positioning pads and the angle of the overhead surgical lights. I have particular habits, small efficiencies I have developed that other nurses do not share. The padding was folded in my specific manner. The light angles matched my preferred configuration exactly. The room smelled faintly of cautery smoke, though no procedures had been performed since the previous afternoon. I checked the electrocautery unit. It was powered off. The smell persisted, subtle but unmistakable, concentrated near the surgical field. I located the room preparation checklist on the documentation board. The form was partially completed. My signature appeared in the preparation column, alongside a timestamp of 2:23 a.m. The handwriting matched mine precisely. I compared it to my badge signature and to previous documentation I had completed. The letter forms, the pressure variations, the slight rightward slant, all identical. I had been asleep in my apartment at 2:23 a.m. I live alone. My badge had not been scanned into the building between my departure at 3:40 p.m. the previous day and my arrival that morning. I verified this with security. I completed the 7 o'clock cholecystectomy without incident. Dr. Brennan noted that the room setup was particularly efficient. I did not mention the pre-existing preparation. The following morning, October 5th, I arrived at 5:16. OR 7 was again prepared before my entry. The setup corresponded to the day's first case, a hernia repair scheduled for 6:30. The instruments were my preferred selection for that procedure type. The patient positioning was already configured for the surgeon's approach. The documentation checklist showed my signature at 1:57 a.m. I began arriving earlier. On October 6th, I entered the hospital at 4:30. I went directly to OR 7. The door was closed. I opened it at 4:32. The room was dark and unprepared. I switched on the lights and began my standard setup routine. At 4:51, I left briefly to retrieve additional suture from the supply room. I was absent for less than 3 minutes. When I returned, the Mayo stand had been repositioned. The instruments I had laid out were rearranged into a more efficient configuration than I had initially chosen. The adjustment was subtle but unmistakable. It reflected a technique I had been practicing mentally but had not yet implemented. No one had entered. The OR doors are audible from the hallway. I had heard nothing. I reported the incidents to the charge nurse on October 7th. She reviewed the badge access logs and the security footage. My badge showed no overnight access. The cameras recorded only my documented entries and exits. No other individuals appeared in the footage. She suggested I might be experiencing stress-related confusion. She recommended I take a personal day. I declined. I returned to OR7 the following morning at 5:15. The room was prepared. The setup reflected not the scheduled procedure, but a case I had been anticipating might be added to the emergency slate. A trauma case, requiring rapid access instruments and additional blood product warmers. The configuration was not documented anywhere. I had only considered it mentally while reviewing the previous day's trauma reports. The phantom preparation knew what I was thinking. I began documenting discrepancies. Each morning, the preparation appeared earlier in the night. October 9th, 1:33 a.m. October 10th, 12:58 a.m. October 11th, 11:42 p.m., before I had even left the building the previous evening. On October 12th, the timestamp read 9:15 p.m. I had still been in OR7 at 9:15, closing out the final case of the day. I checked my documentation from that evening. At 9:15, I had been completing the instrument count with the scrub tech. I specifically remembered that moment. We had disagreed about a missing retractor, which we eventually located under the patient draping. But the preparation checklist insisted I had also been setting up the room simultaneously. I started leaving deliberate errors in my morning setup. On October 13th, I positioned the Mayo stand 6 inches farther from the table than optimal. When I returned from the pre-op briefing, the stand had been corrected to the proper distance. I mixed the instrument sequence, placing the forceps before the scalpels. During the case, I found them rearranged into the correct order. The scrub tech mentioned she appreciated the improved layout. The phantom preparation was refining my work. On October 15th, I arrived at 4 a.m. and hid in the storage alcove adjacent to OR7. I watched the closed door through the narrow window. The lights inside were off. I waited until 6 a.m. The lights never activated. No one entered. At 6:03, I opened the door. The room was fully prepared, lights on, instruments arranged. The checklist showed a timestamp of 4:37 a.m., logged while I'd been watching from the alcove. I began experiencing memory inconsistencies. On October 17th, Dr. Brennan thanked me for assisting with an emergency appendectomy the previous night. I had left the hospital at 4:15 p.m. the previous day. I had been home by 5. I checked the OR log. An emergency appendectomy was documented at 11:20 p.m. on October 16th. My name appeared as the circulating nurse. The case notes described my actions in detail. I had prepared the room, assisted with patient positioning, managed the instrument count, and documented the procedure. The handwriting in the case notes was mine. I contacted the night shift supervisor. She confirmed that I had not been in the building that night. But when she checked the staffing records, my name appeared on the schedule. The electronic timestamp system showed my badge accessing OR7 at 11:04 p.m. and exiting at 12:31 a.m. I was developing a history I had not lived. On October 20th, I found a surgical mask on the documentation desk in OR7. It was still damp with exhalation, the inside foggy with condensation. I had not worn a mask yet that morning. I examined it closely. A single dark hair was caught in the elastic band. The hair matched mine in color and texture. I placed the mask in a biohazard bag and stored it in my locker. That afternoon, between cases, I searched the hospital archives. I requested records of all procedures performed in OR7 over the past decade. I found my name appearing with increasing frequency in older logs in cases I did not remember. The signatures matched mine, but the dates preceded my employment at the hospital. One case was documented on March 3rd, 6 years prior. I had been working at a different hospital then, 200 miles away. But the log insisted I had circulated for an emergency thoracotomy in OR 7 that night. The case notes described my specific techniques, my particular habits. I found 12 similar instances, cases attributed to me before I had been hired, some before I had moved to this city. Each documentation reflected my evolving professional style with uncanny accuracy. I began to suspect I was not preparing the room each morning, I was remembering preparing it. On October 23rd, I arrived at 5:15. OR 7 was prepared, but the setup was incomplete. The surgical drapes were positioned, but the instrument trays remained closed. The documentation checklist showed my signature at 2:08 a.m., but the entry was marked as in progress. I completed the preparation. As I worked, I felt a growing sensation of repetition, as though I were tracing actions I had already performed. My hands moved with automatic precision, selecting instruments I had not consciously chosen. At 5:44, I finished. I signed the checklist in the completion column. My signature overlapped with the earlier entry, the ink merging seamlessly with the existing letter forms. The timestamps were different, but the handwriting was continuous, as though written in a single gesture across hours of separation. I no longer know which preparation is the phantom. I suspect I have been arriving earlier than I remember, completing the setup in a state I do not retain. Or perhaps the version of me that arrives at 5:15 is the echo, repeating the actions of a self that exists in hours I cannot perceive. I reported to OR 7 this morning at 5:15. The room was prepared. I recognized my work immediately, but I also remembered preparing it faintly, in the way one remembers a dream after waking. I recalled standing at the Mayo stand at 2:30 a.m., arranging instruments under the surgical lights, feeling the particular texture of the drapes under my gloved hands. But I also recall being in my apartment at 2:30, asleep. Both memories carry the same weight of reality. I checked the schedule for tomorrow. OR 7 has 3 cases listed. The preparation checklists are already partially completed, my signatures appearing at future timestamps: 1:40 a.m., 3:12 a.m., 4:53 a.m. The ink is still drying on entries that have not yet occurred. I will arrive at 5:15 tomorrow as always. I suspect I will find the room prepared. I suspect I will remember preparing it. And I suspect that the version of me who performs the phantom prep is becoming more persistent than the version who sleeps, the version who believes she goes home at night. Some routines do not require consciousness. Some habits burrow so deeply they continue independent of the person who formed them. And some rooms remember their nurses better than the nurses remember themselves. Story 2. The surgical technologist and the missing instrument count. I closed the count sheet at 9:42 p.m., my tally matching the scrub nurses exactly. 37 instruments accounted for, none retained. I sealed the case documentation and turned toward the cleanup protocol. When I glanced back at the Mayo stand, the number 10 scalpel was missing from its position. It had been there 3 seconds prior. I checked the count sheet. The box for the number 10 scalpel was marked present, but the notation was crossed out in my handwriting with a note beside it: retained. See incident report. I had written no such thing. I have worked as a surgical technologist at Grace Mercy Hospital for 6 years. My primary responsibility involves managing the sterile field during surgical procedures, tracking all instruments, sponges, and sharps to ensure nothing is unintentionally retained in the patient. The count must be accurate at 3 critical points: before the procedure begins, before closing the body cavity, and at final closure. Discrepancies require immediate investigation and cannot be dismissed. The incident began on September 11th during a routine appendectomy in OR4. Dr. Halstead was the attending, with nurse practitioner Voss assisting. I performed the initial count with the circulating nurse, Angela Pruitt. We documented 37 instruments, 12 hemostats, 6 retractors, 8 forceps, 7 scalpels of varying sizes, 3 needle drivers, and 1 suction tip. The count was clean. I logged it at 7:15 p.m. and initiated the procedure. At 8:32 p.m., Dr. Halstead requested closure. I performed the pre-closure count with Angela. We recounted all instruments on the Mayo stand and the back table. Everything was accounted for. I verified each item verbally while Angela marked the count sheet. At 8:41, I completed my documentation. The sheet was clean, no discrepancies. I turned to hand a needle driver to Dr. Halstead. When I looked back at the count sheet, the entry for one of the hemostats had been modified. The original check mark was gone, replaced with a notation in my handwriting. Hemostat number 6 missing. Initiated search protocol. I had written no such notation. I immediately informed Dr. Halstead. We halted the closure and initiated the search protocol. The surgical team examined the cavity, the drapes, the floor surrounding the table, and all disposal containers. The hemostat was not found. I rechecked the count sheet. Now the notation read, hemostat number 6 located under draping, count resolved. But the hemostat had not been located. I had been watching the surgical field continuously. No one had found it. Dr. Halstead ordered an X-ray to verify no instruments remained in the patient. The X-ray was negative. He resumed closure. I performed the final count at 9:08. All instruments were accounted for, including hemostat number 6, which now sat on the Mayo stand in the position it had occupied since the beginning of the case. I had not placed it there. Angela had not placed it there. I asked Angela if she remembered the hemostat going missing. She looked at me with visible confusion and said the count had been clean throughout. I showed her the count sheet. The notations I had seen were gone. The document showed only the original check marks, uninterrupted and consistent. I reported the incident to the shift supervisor, Marshall Klein. He reviewed the count sheet and found no evidence of modifications. He suggested I had misread the document under stress. I did not misread the document. I know my own handwriting. I had seen the notations clearly. 3 days later, on September 14th, I worked a gallbladder removal in OR2. Dr. Nyland was the attending. The initial count was 31 instruments. I documented them meticulously, verifying each serial number against our tracking database. At 10:15 a.m., I completed the pre-closure count. All instruments were accounted for. I sealed the documentation. At 10:19, I noticed one of the retractors was coated in dried blood. The blood had a brown, oxidized appearance, inconsistent with the fresh surgical field. I had cleaned that retractor myself 20 minutes prior. It had been sterile. I showed the retractor to Dr. Nyland. He examined it and asked how long it had been sitting unused. I explained it had been actively employed throughout the case and had been cleaned moments before. He instructed me to remove it from the field and replace it with a new instrument. I complied. When I checked the count sheet, the retractor in question was now marked as contaminated and replaced mid-procedure, with a timestamp of 9:53 a.m. I had made no such notation. The retractor had not been contaminated during the case. I recounted the instruments manually. The contaminated retractor was still in my hand, but the count sheet indicated it had already been removed and replaced. The new retractor Dr. Nyland had requested was not yet on the Mayo stand, but the sheet listed it as present. The documentation was anticipating events that had not yet occurred. I performed the final count at 10:47. The numbers matched the sheet, but the sequence was wrong. Instruments appeared in positions I had not placed them. The needle drivers were reversed. The forceps were grouped differently. I asked the circulating nurse, Marcus Trent, if he had rearranged the instruments. He said he had not touched the sterile field. I checked the count sheet one final time before sealing it. The document now showed a secondary count log beneath my entries, written in my handwriting but documenting a different sequence of events. The secondary log indicated that I had discovered a sponge discrepancy at 10:32 and had resolved it by locating the missing sponge in the patient cavity. No such discrepancy had occurred. No sponge had been missing. I reported the incident to Marshal Klein. He reviewed the count sheet with me present. He saw only my original entries. The secondary log I had observed was not visible to him. He recommended I take a day off to rest. I declined. I returned to work the following day. On September 16th, I was assigned to OR6 for an inguinal hernia repair. The initial count was 28 instruments. I documented each one, photographing the layout with my personal phone for my own records. At 2:30 p.m., I performed the pre-closure count. The numbers did not match. I was missing a scalpel, a number 15 blade. I immediately initiated the search protocol. The surgical team searched for 12 minutes. The scalpel was not found. Dr. Emery ordered an X-ray. The X-ray showed no retained objects. I recounted. Now the scalpel was present on the Mayo stand. I checked my phone photograph. In the original image, the scalpel was absent from the layout. In the current field, it sat exactly where it should have been from the beginning. I compared the timestamp of my photograph to the count sheet. The count sheet indicated the scalpel had been present during the initial count. But my photograph, taken simultaneously with the count, showed it missing. I was beginning to suspect the instruments were moving between counts, retroactively correcting the documentation to match their current state. On September 18th, I accessed the hospital's instrument tracking database. Each instrument is etched with a unique serial number, logged upon purchase and tracked through sterilization cycles and case usage. I searched for the serial numbers of the instruments that had exhibited anomalies. Hemostat number 6, which had disappeared and reappeared on September 11th, was listed as retired from service on August 3rd. The retirement reason: instrument damage during case reference number 3749. Witness: Surgical Tech Graves. Case 3749 was listed as a bowel resection performed in OR4 on August 3rd at 2:30 p.m. I had not worked on August 3rd. I had been on vacation. I checked my personal records. I had been in another state visiting family, but the database insisted I had been present. My name appeared as the primary witness on the incident report. The report described how I had discovered the hemostat had fractured during manipulation and had documented the failure per protocol. The signature on the digital report matched mine. I searched the other instruments. The contaminated retractor from September 14th was listed as destroyed due to sterilization failure on July 19th. The incident report cited my discovery of the failure. I had not worked that day either. The number 15 scalpel from September 16th was retired on September 9th, a week before the hernia repair, due to blade edge defect identified by Surgical Tech Graves. I was being credited with witnessing events I had not experienced, involving instruments that had been removed from service before I used them. On September 21st, I worked an exploratory laparotomy in OR1. The initial count was 42 instruments. I counted them 3 times before beginning, verifying each serial number against the database. 12 of the instruments were listed as retired. I should not have had access to them. They should have been removed from inventory. But they sat on my Mayo stand, pristine and sterile, bearing serial numbers the system claimed no longer existed in active circulation. I documented the discrepancy. I photographed each retired instrument alongside its database entry showing retirement dates. I reported the issue to Marshall Klein before the case began. He examined the instruments. He checked the database on his tablet. According to his view, all instruments were listed as active. No retirement entries appeared. He showed me his screen. The serial numbers matched the instruments, but the status column read active for each one. I showed him my phone displaying the same database with retirement flags. He saw my screen. The entries I was viewing were not visible in his session. He asked if I had modified the database. I had not. I lacked administrative access. He instructed me to proceed with the case using different instruments. I complied, selecting replacements from the sterile storage. The case proceeded without incident. At 5:30 p.m., I rechecked the database. The instruments I had replaced were now listed as damaged during case and retired by Surgical Tech Graves on September 21st at 5:30 p.m. The retirement entry was time-stamped at the moment I checked the database. I had created the retirement record by observing it. I requested access to the archived case logs, specifically case 3749, the bowel resection where I had supposedly witnessed the hemostat failure on August 3rd. The records department provided a physical copy of the case file. The documentation included a witness statement, handwritten on hospital forms. The handwriting was mine. The statement described the incident in my typical phrasing and detail level. It referenced procedural concerns I would have noted. It was signed with my full signature. But I had not written it. I had been in a different state on August 3rd. I compared the statement to my recent documentation. The handwriting was identical, but the ink was aged, the paper slightly yellowed, consistent with a document stored for weeks. I checked the hospital's surveillance archives. I requested footage of OR4 from August 3rd. The records department informed me that footage older than 30 days was automatically deleted unless flagged for incident review. Case 3749 had been flagged. The footage was available. I watched the recording. At 2:30 p.m. on August 3rd, I appeared on screen dressed in surgical attire, assisting with the bowel resection. I observed myself performing the instrument count, discovering the fractured hemostat and documenting the failure. The person in the footage moved with my mannerisms, spoke with my vocal patterns, and documented with my specific habits. But I had not been there. I had been 500 miles away. I contacted the family I had visited in August. I requested confirmation of my presence on August 3rd. They provided photographs. I was in the images, time-stamped at 2:30 p.m. on August 3rd, sitting in their backyard. I existed in two places simultaneously. I reported this to Marshall Klein. He reviewed the surveillance footage and the photographs. He suggested the timestamps were incorrect on one of the records. I checked the metadata. Both timestamps were verified by independent systems. Both were accurate. I began experiencing memory drift. On September 24th, I recalled assisting with a thoracotomy in OR3. I remembered the case clearly. The patient presentation, the surgical approach, the complications we encountered. I remembered Dr. Halstead complimenting my efficiency. I checked the schedule. No thoracotomy had been performed in OR3. The room had been closed for equipment maintenance. But I remembered the case. I could describe the instrument sequence, the blood loss estimates, the closure technique. I searched the case database for thoracotomies in the past week. None were listed. I searched historical records. I found a thoracotomy performed in OR3 on June 2nd, 4 months prior. The case details matched my memory precisely. The attending was Dr. Halstead. The surgical technologist was listed as me. I had not worked on June 2nd. I had been attending a continuing education conference, but the case file insisted I had been present. My signature appeared on the count sheets. The surveillance footage showed me in the OR, performing my role with practiced efficiency. I was developing memories of cases I had not attended, cases the hospital insisted I had documented. On September 27th, I performed a count for a hernia repair in OR 5. The initial count was 33 instruments. I documented them carefully, aware that my documentation might alter itself. At 3:10 p.m., I completed the pre-closure count. The numbers matched. I sealed the documentation. At 3:14, I checked the count sheet. A new entry had appeared, written in my handwriting, documenting a discrepancy that would occur at 3:21. The notation described how I would discover a sponge embedded in the wound and how I would resolve the issue. It was 3:14. The event had not yet occurred. At 3:21, Dr. Nyland requested an additional sponge for unexpected bleeding. I retrieved one from the back table. As I handed it to him, I noticed a different sponge partially obscured in the wound, exactly as the count sheet had predicted. I had documented the future. I am no longer certain which counts I perform and which counts I witness myself performing in records that precede my actions. I suspect my role as a surgical technologist has become untethered from linear time, that my documentation exists independently of my presence, generating witness statements and case logs that I fulfill by reading them. I worked this morning in OR 2. The count was clean. I documented 39 instruments. I sealed the record. Tonight I accessed the database. The count sheet has already been amended with notations I will apparently write tomorrow, describing discrepancies that will occur in a case I have not yet been assigned. The future counts are always accurate. The past counts are always incomplete. I suspect I am not managing the instruments. I am becoming part of their inventory, tracked and cycled and retired according to protocols I do not control. Some records write themselves through the people assigned to keep them, and some witnesses exist only to confirm what the documentation has already decided. Story 3, the operating room scheduler's ghost procedure. The case request appeared on my screen at 9:37 a.m., flagged urgent. Patient initials, e.g. procedure type, exploratory with possible resection. No attending listed, no pre-op clearance attached. I clicked to review the details, but the window closed automatically. When I refreshed the schedule board, the case had populated across 3 different rooms simultaneously, each showing a start time 30 minutes in the past. I tried to delete the entries. The system logged me as the requesting physician. I have worked as the primary operating room scheduler for Grace Mercy Hospital for 11 years. My responsibilities include coordinating surgical cases, managing room allocations, confirming physician availability, verifying patient clearances, and maintaining the master schedule across 8 operating rooms. The scheduling software is updated in real time and synchronized across all hospital systems. Errors are rare and typically resolved through standard administrative protocols. On October 9th, I arrived at my desk at 7 a.m. and logged into the scheduling system. I began reviewing the day's cases, confirming that all procedures had the required documentation and that no conflicts existed in room assignments. At 9:37 a.m., a new case request appeared in my pending queue. The notification chimed, and a red flag indicated urgency. I opened the request. The patient initials were listed as EG. The procedure type was documented as exploratory laparotomy with possible bowel resection. The requested date was October 9th, the current day. The preferred start time was listed as 9 a.m., 37 minutes prior. The attending physician field was blank. The requesting department showed only OR administration. No preoperative clearance was attached. No anesthesia consult was documented. The patient medical record number was incomplete, showing only partial digits. I attempted to contact the requesting party using the system's internal messaging feature. The message failed to send, returning an error. Recipient not found in directory. I checked the patient database using the initials e.g. 17 patients matched those initials currently admitted to the hospital. None had pending surgical cases. I flagged the request as erroneous and moved it to the deleted queue. The system required a reason for deletion. I typed, incomplete information, no attending assigned, no patient match. I submitted the deletion. The system confirmed the action. At 9:41, the request reappeared in my pending queue identical to before. The timestamp now read 9:41 a.m. The preferred start time had updated to 9:30 a.m. I deleted it again. I added a note in the system log to investigate potential software malfunction. At 9:43, the request reappeared. This time, the preferred start time was listed as 9:40 a.m. The case was tracking forward, updating its requested time to remain 30 minutes behind the current time. I contacted the IT department. Gerald Moss answered. I explained the recurring case request. He remotely accessed my terminal and reviewed the pending queue. He saw no case request for patient EG. According to his view, my pending queue was empty. I shared my screen with him using the remote access function. He observed my screen directly. He confirmed he could see the case request on my display. But when he checked the database from his terminal, the request did not exist. He suggested the issue was isolated to my user profile. He logged me out and reset my session. I logged back in. The case request was still present. It had now been automatically approved and added to the master schedule. It was assigned to OR3 with a start time of 10 a.m. I had not approved it. I had deleted it multiple times. I opened the master schedule board. OR3 showed the EG case listed between two confirmed procedures. The case was marked as in progress, despite the start time being 19 minutes in the future. I checked OR3's physical status. I walked to the operating room and looked through the observation window. The room was dark and unoccupied. No case was in progress. I returned to my desk. The schedule board now showed the EG case as completed. The end time was listed as 10:14 a.m. The current time was 9:56 a.m. I checked the case documentation. A full operative report had been generated, written in standard medical language. The attending was listed as Dr. E. Graves. We have no physician by that name on staff. The anesthesiologist was listed as Dr. E. Grant. That name also did not appear in our directory. The procedure notes described a successful exploratory laparotomy with bowel resection. The patient tolerated the procedure well. Estimated blood loss, 200 milliliters, no complications. The report was signed electronically with my administrative credentials. I had not generated that report. I had not signed it. I contacted Gerald Moss again. He reviewed the completed case. According to his terminal, the case did not exist in the database. The operative report I was viewing was not present in the system, but I was looking at it. It was on my screen, fully detailed and formatted correctly. He suggested I document the incident and sign out for the day. He would investigate potential data corruption. I declined to leave. I had 8 operating rooms to manage with 14 procedures scheduled for the remainder of the day. At 10:23 a.m., the EG case reappeared in my pending queue. The request was identical to the original, but the preferred date was now October 10th, the following day. I ignored it. I focused on managing the confirmed cases. At 11:05, I received an automated message from the billing department. The message stated that the EG case from October 9th required additional documentation for insurance processing. The billing coordinator, Helen Trask, requested that I provide the missing preoperative clearance forms. I called Helen. I explained that the EG case had not actually occurred. It was a software error. She said the case had been billed. The charges had been submitted to the patient's insurance. The claim referenced my scheduler identification number as the authorizing administrator. I asked her to send me the billing record. She transmitted it to my terminal. The record showed a detailed breakdown of charges: operating room time, anesthesia, surgical instruments, post-operative care. The total billed amount was $12,347. The case duration was listed as 2 hours and 14 minutes. The patient name was listed as Graves E. I searched the patient database for Graves E. No results. I asked Helen if she had contact information for the patient. She provided a medical record number. I searched using that number. The record belonged to me. The medical record number was mine. The date of birth, the address, the insurance information, all mine. The patient was me. I reviewed the operative report more carefully. The case described an exploratory laparotomy performed on Eleanor Graves, my full legal name. The indication for surgery was recurrent abdominal pain of unknown origin. The findings included moderate adhesions, partial bowel obstruction, resected segment sent to pathology. I have never had abdominal surgery. I have never experienced symptoms requiring surgical intervention. I checked my abdomen. No scars, no tenderness, no evidence of recent surgery. But the record insisted the procedure had been performed. It included post-operative care instructions, prescriptions for pain management, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for October 16th. I contacted the hospital's medical records department. I requested a full copy of my patient file. They provided it electronically. My file showed a surgical admission on October 9th at 8:45 a.m. Preoperative notes documented my reported symptoms, my consent for surgery, and my clearance by anesthesia. Intraoperative notes described the procedure in clinical detail. Postoperative notes documented my recovery in the PACU and my discharge at 2:30 p.m. I had been at my desk continuously from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. on October 9th. I had not been admitted. I had not undergone surgery, but the records insisted I had. The timestamps aligned. The documentation was thorough and consistent. I checked the surveillance footage from October 9th. I requested video from the OR3 camera and from the PACU. The footage showed me on a stretcher being wheeled into OR3 at 8:52 a.m. I was unconscious, prepared for surgery. The surgical team was visible, working efficiently. The procedure lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. I was then transferred to the PACU, where I remained until 2:28 p.m. I watched myself undergoing a surgery I never experienced. I checked the footage from my office. From 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., I was visible at my desk, working continuously. I was present in my office throughout the same hours I was supposedly in surgery. Both versions were documented. Both were real. I reported the incident to the hospital administration. I met with the Director of Operations, Samuel Pruitt. I showed him the duplicate records, the billing documents, the surveillance footage showing 2 simultaneous versions of me. He reviewed the evidence carefully. He confirmed the records existed. He confirmed the billing had been processed. He confirmed the surveillance showed me in 2 locations simultaneously. He suggested the footage had been corrupted, possibly duplicated from different dates and merged incorrectly. I checked the metadata on the footage. The timestamps were verified by the camera system's internal clock, which syncs with the hospital's central server. The footage was authentic and unedited. Samuel recommended I take medical leave while the incident was investigated. He expressed concern about the stress I must be experiencing. I took 3 days off. I returned on October 13th. The EG case request had continued to appear daily in my pending queue. Each day, it requested a procedure for the following day. Each day I deleted it. Each day it reappeared, eventually auto-populating onto the master schedule and completing itself. I now had 5 operative reports in my patient file, each describing a different procedure. Exploratory laparotomy, hernia repair, appendectomy, cholecystectomy, and bowel resection. The dates spanned October 9th through October 13th. The attending physicians varied, but none were names I recognized. I had attended work every day. I had experienced no symptoms and no absences, but my medical file documented 5 surgeries, each with complete records, each billed and processed. I checked my insurance statements. The claims had been paid. My insurance company had processed over $60,000 in surgical charges in 5 days. I contacted my insurance provider. I disputed the claims. I explained the procedures had not occurred. They requested documentation from the hospital proving the procedures were performed. The hospital provided the operative reports, the billing records, and the surveillance footage. The insurance company concluded the claims were valid. On October 15th, I stopped deleting the EG case requests. I allowed them to auto-populate onto the schedule. I watched as they completed themselves, generating reports and billing without my intervention. I began reviewing the historical schedule, searching for similar anomalies. I accessed archives dating back 5 years. I found irregular case entries appearing sporadically, always with incomplete information, always auto-completing without confirmed authorization. The patient initials varied, but they consistently formed the initials of hospital staff members. I found cases attributed to Gerald Moss, Helen Trask, Samuel Pruitt, and others. Each ghost case eventually manifested a completed operative report, billed and documented. I checked the medical files of the staff members whose initials appeared. Each had surgical procedures documented in their patient records, procedures they did not recall undergoing. Gerald Moss had 3 ghost cases. Helen Trask had 7. Samuel Pruitt had 12. The ghost procedures had been occurring for years, silently accumulating in staff medical files, billing insurance, generating revenue. I requested a meeting with the hospital's chief financial officer. I presented the evidence. I showed the pattern of ghost cases, the impossible billing, the duplicate existence documented in surveillance. She reviewed the financials. The ghost cases represented significant revenue. The procedures were billed correctly, paid without dispute, and caused no apparent harm. She asked if I had experienced any medical complications from the documented surgeries. I had not. I was asymptomatic. But my medical file insisted I had undergone 5 invasive procedures in 5 days. She suggested the system was operating as designed. The cases were documented, billed, and resolved. From an administrative perspective, they were successful procedures. I asked what happened to the patients. She said the patients were fine. They had all recovered without issue. I asked if the patients were real. She said the records were real. That was sufficient. I returned to my desk. I stopped questioning the EG case requests. I allowed them to populate, complete, and bill. Each day a new procedure appears. Each day my patient file grows thicker. This morning I checked my medical record. I now have 47 documented surgical procedures spanning the past 3 weeks. The most recent is scheduled for tomorrow. A thoracotomy with possible lung resection. The attending is listed as Dr. Eleanor Graves. I am apparently operating on myself. I will be at my desk tomorrow managing the schedule as always. But according to the system, I will also be on the operating table, undergoing a procedure I will not feel, performed by a version of me that exists only in records that write themselves through the people assigned to maintain them. Some schedules do not require actual patients. Some procedures fulfill themselves simply by being documented. And some systems remember their administrators better as subjects than as staff. Story 4. The anesthesia resident's second induction. I administered propofol at a rate of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram per minute, watching the monitor as the patient's consciousness faded. The waveform showed the expected decline. Heart rate steady at 72, blood pressure 115/68, oxygen saturation 98%. Then a second set of vitals appeared on the right side of the screen overlaying the first. Heart rate 89, blood pressure 140/92, oxygen saturation 94% and falling. I had induced one patient. The monitor was tracking 2. I am a second-year anesthesia resident at Grace Mercy Hospital. My training includes managing anesthesia for general, orthopedic, and cardiovascular surgeries. I am supervised by attending anesthesiologists, but I am responsible for induction, maintenance, and emergence for my assigned cases. My performance is evaluated on technical proficiency, situational awareness, and patient safety. On November 2nd, I was assigned to OR6 for a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. The patient was a 57-year-old male with no significant comorbidities. Preoperative assessment was unremarkable. I reviewed his chart, confirmed the surgical consent, and verified that all required lab work was complete. At 8:15 a.m., the patient was transferred to the operating table. I introduced myself, confirmed his identity using 2 independent identifiers, and explained the anesthesia process. He was cooperative and appropriately anxious. At 8:22, I began the induction sequence. I administered midazolam for anxiolysis, followed by fentanyl for analgesia. I pre-oxygenated the patient using a face mask at 100% oxygen for 3 minutes. His oxygen saturation remained at 99%. At 8:26, I administered propofol intravenously at the calculated dose. The patient's eyelid reflex diminished. His breathing slowed. I confirmed loss of consciousness by calling his name and observing no response. The monitor displayed his vitals. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 115/68, oxygen saturation 98%. The waveform was stable. At 8:27, a second set of vitals appeared on the monitor. The display split, showing 2 separate patients. The left side continued to track the 57-year-old male I had induced. The right side displayed different values. Heart rate 89, blood pressure 140/92, oxygen saturation 94% and declining. I checked the monitor connections. Only one patient was connected. The sensors were attached correctly to the 57-year-old male. I looked at the right side of the screen. The patient identifier read Graves, K. Dobbs, same as mine. I am Caitlin Graves. The second set of vitals belonged to someone with my name and birth date. I called for the supervising anesthesiologist, Dr. Brenner. He was in OR4. I explained the monitor anomaly. He said he would come immediately. The secondary vitals continued to deteriorate. The oxygen saturation on the right side dropped to 87%. The heart rate increased to 103. The blood pressure rose to 152/99. The primary patient, the 57-year-old male, remained stable. His vitals were appropriate for the induction phase. I increased the oxygen flow. The primary patient's saturation remained at 98%. The secondary vitals did not respond. Dr. Brenner arrived at 8:31. He examined the monitor. He saw only one set of vitals. The primary patient, stable and appropriate. I pointed to the right side of the screen where the secondary vitals continued to decline. He looked. He said the screen was blank on the right side. There were no secondary vitals visible. I was looking directly at them. Heart rate 112. Oxygen saturation 81%. Blood pressure 161/104. Dr. Brenner suggested I was fatigued. He asked when I had last slept. I had slept adequately. I was not impaired. He instructed me to proceed with intubation. I complied. I inserted the laryngoscope, visualized the vocal cords, and placed the endotracheal tube. I confirmed placement with capnography. The primary patient was successfully intubated. The secondary vitals showed worsening hypoxia. Oxygen saturation, 73%. I ventilated the primary patient manually. His chest rose symmetrically. His oxygen saturation remained stable at 98%. The secondary vitals indicated severe distress. Oxygen saturation, 68%, heart rate 121. I told Dr. Brenner the secondary patient was crashing. He said there was no secondary patient. He instructed me to focus on the actual case. I continued managing the primary patient. I transitioned to mechanical ventilation, set the tidal volume and respiratory rate, and confirmed adequate end-tidal CO2. The primary patient was stable. At 8:41, the secondary vitals flatlined. Heart rate, 0. Oxygen saturation, 0. Blood pressure, unreadable. The alarm did not sound. The monitor displayed the flatline data silently on the right side of the screen. Dr. Brenner did not react. He continued reviewing the anesthesia record on his tablet, unaware of the secondary patient's deterioration. I asked if he saw the flatline. He said the monitor showed normal sinus rhythm appropriate for the case. I took a photograph of the monitor with my phone. The image showed both sets of vitals. The primary patient stable on the left, the secondary patient flatlined on the right. The surgery proceeded without incident. The cholecystectomy was completed at 9:37 a.m. I managed the emergence, extubated the patient, and transferred him to the PACU. He recovered normally. I reviewed the photograph I had taken. The secondary vitals were visible in the image, time-stamped at 8:41 a.m. I checked the anesthesia record. The automated data export from the monitor showed only the primary patient's vitals. No secondary data appeared in the record, but my photograph proved the secondary vitals had been displayed. I reported the incident to Dr. Brenner after the case. I showed him the photograph. He examined it carefully. He asked if I had edited the image. I had not. The metadata was intact. The timestamp matched the case timeline. He said the monitor had malfunctioned, possibly displaying ghost data from a previous case. He instructed me to document the equipment issue and request a service inspection. I documented the incident. I submitted a maintenance request for the OR6 monitor. On November 4th, I was assigned to OR2 for a hernia repair. Different room, different equipment. The patient was a 32-year-old female, healthy, no complications anticipated. At 10:15 a.m., I began the induction. I administered the standard sequence, midazolam, fentanyl, propofol. The patient responded appropriately. Loss of consciousness occurred at 10:18. The monitor displayed her vitals, heart rate 67, blood pressure 108/65, oxygen saturation 99%. At 10:19, the secondary vitals appeared. Patient identifier, Graves K. The values showed a patient in distress. Heart rate 118, oxygen saturation 79%, blood pressure 170/108. The secondary patient was being induced simultaneously with the primary patient, but the secondary induction was failing. I called for Dr. Brenner immediately. He arrived within 2 minutes. He saw only the primary patient's vitals. The monitor, according to him, showed no secondary data. I took another photograph. The secondary vitals were visible in the image. I asked Dr. Brenner to review the anesthesia machine settings. He confirmed the settings were correct for the primary patient. I asked if another patient might be connected to the system through a network error. He checked the system logs. Only one patient was registered to OR2. The secondary vitals continued to worsen. I watched Caitlin Graves crash again. Heart rate 135, oxygen saturation 61%. I intubated the primary patient. She tolerated the procedure well. The secondary patient flatlined at 1024, heart rate 0, oxygen saturation unreadable. I had killed Caitlin Graves twice. On November 7th, I requested access to the hospital's central anesthesia database. I wanted to review all cases where I had served as the primary anesthesia provider. I searched for any documented complications, any patient outcomes that might explain the secondary vitals. I found 2 anomalies. On October 14th and October 19th, cases I had managed showed duplicate anesthesia records. Each case had 2 separate logs, one documenting the actual patient and one documenting a patient named Graves K. The secondary logs described failed inductions. In both cases, the patient Graves K experienced severe hypoxia, cardiovascular instability, and cardiopulmonary arrest. The secondary logs were marked as training simulation data and flagged as non-clinical. But they were time-stamped to coincide with my actual cases. They were not simulations performed separately. They were logged as occurring simultaneously with my real patients. I checked the authorship of the secondary logs. They were auto-generated by the anesthesia monitoring system attributed to my user credentials. I had not created simulation logs. I had been managing real patients. On November 9th, I worked an emergency appendectomy in OR 5. The patient was a 19-year-old male, previously healthy. The case was straightforward. I induced at 11:43 p.m. The primary patient responded normally. The secondary vitals appeared immediately. Caitlin Graves was back, already in distress. Heart rate 107, oxygen saturation 83%. I decided to manage both patients simultaneously. I adjusted my technique, administering the induction drugs more slowly, monitoring the secondary vitals as closely as the primary. The primary patient stabilized as expected. The secondary patient continued to deteriorate despite my adjustments. I intubated the primary patient successfully. I attempted to improve the secondary patient's oxygenation by adjusting the ventilator settings on my actual patient, hypothesizing that the systems might be linked. The secondary patient did not respond. Heart rate 141, oxygen saturation 57%. I asked Dr. Brenner, who was supervising remotely via video link, if he had any recommendations for managing a patient with refractory hypoxia during induction. He asked why I was asking. The current case was uncomplicated. I explained I was concerned about a hypothetical scenario. He said to follow standard protocols and escalate to advanced airway management if needed. I followed his advice on the primary patient, who required no intervention. The secondary patient arrested at 11:51 p.m. I was killing myself repeatedly every time I induced a patient. On November 12th, I accessed the hospital's personnel records. I searched for any other staff members named Caitlin Graves. No results. I was the only person with that name employed at the hospital. I searched the patient database. I found 17 admissions under the name Graves K, spanning the past 8 weeks. Each admission coincided with a case I had managed. Each documented a failed induction, cardiopulmonary arrest, and death in the OR. Each case listed me as both the anesthesia provider and the patient. I was simultaneously administering and receiving anesthesia. I reviewed the autopsy reports for the deceased, Graves K patients. The cause of death was consistently listed as anesthesia complication, hypoxic brain injury, cardiopulmonary arrest. The reports describe my body in clinical detail: height, weight, identifying marks, all accurate to my physical characteristics. I have not died. I am still working. But the records insist I have died 17 times. I met with the hospital's risk management department. I presented the duplicate records, the photographs of the secondary vitals, the autopsy reports listing me as deceased. They reviewed the documentation. They confirmed the records existed and were genuine entries in the hospital database. They suggested the records resulted from a software error, possibly a corruption in the patient identifier system that was accidentally linking my credentials to training simulations or data entry mistakes. They offered to expunge the erroneous records from the database. I asked what would happen if they deleted the records of my deaths. They said nothing would happen. The records were errors. Deleting them would simply clean the database. I declined. I asked them to leave the records intact. On November 15th, I induced a patient for a thoracotomy in OR1. The secondary vitals appeared as usual. Caitlin Graves crashed as usual. But this time I felt it. As the secondary patient's oxygen saturation dropped, I experienced a sensation of breathlessness, a tightness in my chest. As the secondary heart rate spiked, I felt palpitations. I was physiologically connected to the secondary patient. I managed the primary patient through the induction successfully, but I was simultaneously experiencing the failed induction myself. I felt the hypoxia, the panic, the cardiovascular collapse. At 12:03 p.m., the secondary patient arrested. I felt my own heart stutter. I felt a moment of absence, a gap in my perception. Dr. Gunnar Brenner asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. I completed the case. I am no longer certain which patient I am. I administer anesthesia to others, but I also receive it in a parallel case that only I can observe. I successfully manage inductions, but I also fail them, dying repeatedly in a version of the OR that exists only on monitors I alone can see. This morning I checked the database. I have now died 31 times. Each death is documented, autopsied, and filed. Each death occurs while I am standing at the head of the table managing a living patient. I am scheduled for an induction in OR3 this afternoon. I will administer propofol. I will intubate the patient. I will ensure their safety. And I will watch myself die again, on a monitor that no one else can see, in a version of the case that only I experience. Some deaths do not require bodies. Some failures repeat through the people trained to prevent them. And some residents learn their craft by practicing on themselves in procedures that document their demise every time they try to save someone else. Story 5. The OR Sterile Processing Workers Returning Tray. I sealed the instrument tray at 2:17 p.m., verified the autoclave cycle completion, and placed the sterilization indicator strip in the log. The strip was green, confirming the cycle reached the required temperature and pressure. I shelved the tray in the sterile storage room slot C12. At 2:23, the same tray appeared in the soiled return cart, still warm, instruments coated with fresh blood and tissue. The autoclave log showed no subsequent cycles. The tray had been used, but no one had retrieved it. I have worked in sterile processing at Grace Mercy Hospital for 14 years. My responsibilities include decontaminating surgical instruments, operating the autoclave sterilization equipment, verifying sterilization efficacy, and maintaining inventory of sterile trays for the operating rooms. The work is procedural and predictable. Instruments are returned soiled, I clean them, sterilize them, and return them to circulation. The cycle is continuous and essential. On October 21st, I processed a standard general surgery tray, designated Tray G14. The tray contained 32 instruments: scalpels, forceps, hemostats, retractors, and scissors. I decontaminated each instrument manually using enzymatic solution, scrubbing visible debris and rinsing thoroughly. I inspected each piece for damage or wear. All instruments were intact and functional. At 1:45 p.m., I loaded tray G14 into the autoclave. I selected the standard sterilization cycle, 270 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 pounds per square inch, duration 45 minutes. I initiated the cycle and logged the start time. At 2:32 p.m., the autoclave completed the cycle. The pressure released automatically. I allowed the chamber to cool for 8 minutes before opening the door. I removed tray G14. The instruments were hot and dry. I verified the sterilization indicator strip. It had changed from blue to green, confirming the cycle had reached the required parameters. I documented the cycle in the sterilization log, tray G14, cycle completion 2:32 p.m. Indicator positive, processed by Graves. I sealed the tray in sterile wrap and labeled it with the date, time, and my initials. I transported it to the sterile storage room and placed it in slot C12. The tray was ready for use. At 2:41 p.m., I returned to the decontamination area to begin processing the next batch of soiled instruments. I found tray G14 in the soiled return cart. The tray was warm. The instruments were coated with blood, viscera, and tissue fragments. The tray had been used. I checked the storage room. Slot C12 was empty. Tray G14 had been retrieved and returned in 9 minutes. I checked the OR schedule. No procedures had been completed in the past hour. The nearest case completion was at 2:10 p.m., 31 minutes before I had shelved the sterile tray. I checked the instrument tracking log. Tray G14 showed no record of being issued. According to the log, the tray was still in sterile storage, unused. But it was in my decontamination sink, soiled and warm. I examined the instruments. The blood was fresh, not coagulated. The tissue fragments were moist. The instruments had been used recently within minutes. I processed the tray again. I decontaminated, inspected, and sterilized it using the same protocol. At 3:58 p.m., I completed the cycle, verified the indicator, and returned the tray to storage. At 4:06 p.m., the tray reappeared in the soiled return cart. Warm, contaminated, recently used. I reported the incident to the sterile processing supervisor, Marcus Trent. He reviewed the autoclave logs and the instrument tracking system. The logs showed tray G14 had been sterilized twice that afternoon, at 2:32 and 3:58. No usage was documented between cycles. Marcus examined the soiled instruments. He confirmed the contamination was fresh. He hypothesized that the tracking system was malfunctioning, failing to log the tray's usage. He instructed me to continue processing. He would investigate the tracking system. I sterilized tray G14 a third time. At 5:32 p.m., the cycle completed. I stored the tray. At 5:39, it returned soiled. I began documenting the timestamps. I created a detailed log of each sterilization cycle and each return. The pattern was consistent. The tray returned approximately 7 to 9 minutes after being shelved, regardless of OR activity. On October 22nd, I repeated the experiment. I sterilized tray G14 and stored it at 8:15 a.m. At 8:23, it returned soiled. I examined the instruments more carefully. The wear patterns had changed. The scalpel blades showed additional nicks. The hemostats had new scratches. The instruments were aging with each cycle. I compared the serial numbers to the inventory database. The instruments in tray G14 matched the database records, but the documented purchase dates were inconsistent. The database showed some instruments as recently acquired, but their physical wear suggested years of use. I measured the blade edge of one scalpel with a micrometer. I sterilized the tray and stored it. When it returned 9 minutes later, I measured the same blade. It had worn down by 0.03 millimeters. The tray was being used intensively during the minutes it spent in storage. On October 24th, I decided to track the tray physically. I sterilized it, and instead of storing it in the sterile room, I kept it in my direct line of sight in the processing area. I placed it on a clean counter and watched it continuously. At 9:37 a.m., the tray vanished. It was there, and then it was not. I had been looking directly at it. At 9:45, the tray reappeared in the soiled return cart. 8 minutes had passed. The tray had been used somewhere I could not observe. I reported the incident to Marcus. I showed him my documentation, the timestamp logs, the wear measurements. He suggested I was overworked. He recommended I take time off. I declined. I continued processing. On October 27th, I sterilized tray G14 and attached a small temperature sensor to one of the instruments hidden beneath the wrapping. The sensor logged temperature readings every 30 seconds and stored the data internally. I shelved the tray at 10:12 a.m. At 10:19, it returned soiled. I retrieved the temperature sensor. The data showed a temperature spike at 10:14, consistent with exposure to body temperature. The sensor recorded sustained warmth for 6 minutes, followed by a return to ambient temperature. The tray had been inside a patient. I reviewed the autoclave logs for the past month. I searched for other trays exhibiting similar patterns. I found 6 additional trays that showed multiple sterilization cycles per day with no corresponding usage logs. Each tray returned soiled within minutes of being shelved. I expanded my search to the past year. 38 trays exhibited the pattern. Each had been sterilized hundreds of times, far exceeding the expected usage rate for their designated specialties. I cross-referenced the trays with OR case logs. None of the excess sterilizations corresponded to documented procedures. The trays were being used in surgeries that were not officially occurring. On November 1st, I accessed the hospital's historical records. I searched for unusual patterns in sterile processing activity. I found that the returning tray phenomenon had been occurring intermittently for 18 years, dating back to before my employment. I located incident reports filed by previous sterile processing staff. The reports described identical experiences, trays returning soiled within minutes of sterilization, instruments aging rapidly, no documented usage. Each incident report concluded with a recommendation for equipment inspection. No follow-up actions were documented. The phenomenon had been dismissed repeatedly as equipment malfunction or human error. I checked the personnel records for the staff who had filed the reports. 5 individuals. 3 had left the hospital within months of filing their reports. 1 had transferred to a different department. 1 had died. The deceased staff member was Walter Voss. He had worked in sterile processing for 22 years. His death occurred in November 19 years prior. Cause: cardiac arrest while on duty in the decontamination area. I requested the incident report from his death. The report described how Walter had been found collapsed beside an autoclave, tray G14 in his hands. The tray was hot, having just completed a cycle. Walter showed no vital signs. Resuscitation attempts failed. The autopsy attributed his death to acute myocardial infarction, unrelated to workplace conditions. Tray G14 was the tray that kept returning to me. I researched the instruments in tray G14. I traced their procurement history. Most had been purchased 12 years ago, but 2 instruments, a specific hemostat and a retractor, had been in inventory for over 20 years. Those 2 instruments predated Walter Voss's death. I examined those instruments closely. The wear was extensive, far beyond what 12 or even 20 years of normal use would produce. The metal showed microfractures visible under magnification. The instruments had been used thousands of times. On November 5th, I sterilized tray G14 and instead of storing it, I placed it in a locked cabinet in a storage room separate from the sterile processing area. I secured the cabinet with a padlock. Only I had the key. At 11:14 a.m., I checked the cabinet. The tray was gone. The lock was still engaged. The cabinet door was closed. At 11:21, the tray appeared in the soiled return cart. I opened the locked cabinet again. The tray was inside, sterile and sealed, in addition to the soiled tray in the return cart. The tray had duplicated. I processed both trays. I sterilized them simultaneously in separate autoclaves. Both completed their cycles at 12:38 p.m. I stored both trays in different locations, one in the sterile room, one in the locked cabinet. At 12:46, both trays returned soiled. 2 copies of tray G14, both used, both warm. I sterilized them again. At 2:15, they returned. Now there were 3 copies in the soiled cart. I stopped processing. I left all 3 trays contaminated and reported the situation to Marcus. He came to the decontamination area. He saw only 1 tray in the soiled cart. According to him, there was no duplication. I was looking at 3 trays. He saw 1. I photographed the 3 trays. The image showed only 1 tray. The duplicates were not captured by the camera. I realized the additional trays existed only in my perception. The duplication was internal, a reflection of repeated processing compressed into simultaneous awareness. I have processed tray G14 thousands of times. Each sterilization creates a version of the tray that continues through its usage cycle, returning inevitably to me. The versions accumulate, overlapping until I perceive multiple trays existing simultaneously in the same space. On November 8th, I found entries in the autoclave log time-stamped in the future. Tray G14 was listed as sterilized on November 9th at 9:45 a.m., November 10th at 1:30 p.m., and November 12th at 11:20 a.m. The cycles had not yet occurred, but the log insisted they had already been completed, processed by me. This morning I sterilized tray G14 and placed it in storage. I watched the clock. At 8:17 the tray returned soiled. I decontaminated it. At 9:03 I completed the next sterilization cycle. While the autoclave was running, I checked the log. My entry for the 9:03 cycle was already present, time-stamped and signed before the cycle had finished. I am documenting actions I have not yet completed. The system anticipates my processing because the processing is inevitable. The tray will return. I will sterilize it. The cycle has no beginning and no end. I have become part of the tray's circulation. I exist in the sterile processing area, perpetually decontaminating, loading, sterilizing, storing. The tray returns because I am always here, always processing, in a version of time that loops through itself. I checked the personnel database. My employment record shows continuous service for 14 years. But my time card shows entries extending into the future, documenting shifts I have not yet worked. I suspect I will not leave. I suspect I am Walter Voss, or I will become Walter Voss, collapsing beside the autoclave, tray G14 in my hands, having processed it one final time in an infinite series of final times. Some instruments never finish being cleaned. Some cycles continue through the people who maintain them. And some trays return not from the operating room but from a version of the processing area where sterilization is the only task that exists, repeated forever by staff who can no longer remember they were supposed to go home. Story 6, the surgical assistant's closed incision that opened again. I placed the final subcuticular suture at 4:37 p.m., running the absorbable thread smoothly beneath the dermis. Dr. Halstead inspected my closure, nodded approval, and applied the sterile dressing. The wound edges were perfectly approximated, tension distributed evenly. At 6:15, a nurse paged me to the recovery unit. The patient's incision was open, edges separated by 3 centimeters, exposing the fascial layer beneath. The sutures remained in place, undisturbed, but the tissue had separated cleanly as though the closure had never been performed. Dr. Halstead's operative note listed 2 surgical assistants, myself and someone named E. Sevarg. I have worked as a surgical assistant at Grace Mercy Hospital for 8 years. My role involves supporting the operating surgeon during procedures, maintaining exposure, controlling bleeding, suturing, and ensuring the sterile field remains uncompromised. I specialize in general and vascular surgery. My technique is deliberate and precise. I have never had a wound dehiscence attributed to my closures. On November 16th, I assisted Dr. Halstead with a ventral hernia repair in OR4. The patient was a 63-year-old male with a history of previous abdominal surgeries. The procedure involved reducing the hernia, placing a synthetic mesh, and closing the fascial and skin layers. The surgery progressed routinely. At 4:18 p.m., Dr. Halstead completed the mesh placement and asked me to begin the closure. I closed the fascial layer using interrupted polydioxanone sutures, spacing them 1 centimeter apart, ensuring adequate tissue purchase and knot security. I irrigated the subcutaneous space and closed it in 2 layers using absorbable suture. At 4:37 p.m., I began the skin closure. I used a subcuticular technique, running a continuous absorbable suture beneath the epidermis to minimize scarring. I maintained even tension, ensuring the wound edges approximated without gaps or overlap. At 4:42, I completed the closure. Dr. Halstead inspected it. He commented that the result was excellent, with precise edge alignment and minimal tension on the suture line. I applied a sterile dressing. The patient was transferred to the post-anesthesia care unit at 4:58 p.m. At 6:15, I received a page from the PASU. The patient's wound had opened. I went to the PASU immediately. I examined the incision. The dressing was still in place, undisturbed. I removed it carefully. The incision was open. The wound edges were separated by approximately 3 centimeters. The fascial layer beneath was visible, dry and intact. The skin edges appeared clean, without trauma, tearing, or inflammation. The subcuticular sutures were still in place. I could see the thread running beneath the dermis exactly as I had placed it. But the tissue above the sutures had separated, as though the skin had retracted from the closure independently. I checked the patient's vital signs and lab work. No fever, no signs of infection, no coagulopathy. The patient reported no pain, no cough, no straining that might have disrupted the closure. I informed Dr. Halstead. He examined the wound. He was visibly confused. The closure had been solid. There was no mechanical explanation for the dehiscence. He asked if I was certain I had completed the skin closure. I confirmed I had. He had personally inspected it before the dressing was applied. We reviewed the operative photos taken at the end of the case. The images showed a closed incision with perfect edge approximation. The timestamp was 4:44 p.m. We took new photos at 6:21. The incision was open. Dr. Halstead decided to return the patient to the OR for reclosure. At 7:30 p.m., we reopened OR4. I re-prepped the wound. The fascial layer remained intact. No bleeding, no infection, no explanation for the skin separation. I reclosed the skin using the same subcuticular technique. This time, Dr. Halstead observed my every movement. He confirmed my technique was flawless. I completed the closure at 7:52 p.m. We applied a reinforced dressing. The patient was returned to the PASCU at 8:10 p.m. At 9:37 p.m., I received another page. The incision was open again. I returned to the PASCU. The wound was separated identically to before. 3 centimeters, clean edges, sutures intact, but tissue retracted. Dr. Halstead reviewed the patient thoroughly. He ordered labs, imaging, dermatology consult. Every test returned normal. No underlying pathology explained the repeated dehiscence. We returned the patient to the OR at 10:45 p.m. This time, Dr. Halstead performed the closure himself while I assisted. He used a different technique, interrupted nylon sutures placed through full-thickness skin. He tied each knot with excessive tension, ensuring the wound could not possibly separate. We finished at 11:21 p.m. The patient was monitored continuously in the PASC-U. At 12:53 a.m., the incision opened again. The nylon sutures were intact, but the skin had separated between them. Dr. Halstead was at a loss. He consulted with two other surgeons. They examined the patient and found no medical explanation. At 2:15 a.m., we attempted a third closure using staples. Metal surgical staples placed closely together, creating a mechanically strong closure. At 3:41 a.m., the staples remained in place, but the skin between them had separated, creating small gaps that collectively opened the incision. Dr. Halstead documented the case as an unexplained wound failure. He transferred the patient to the ICU for close observation and postponed further attempts at closure until consultants could evaluate the situation. I went home at 4:30 a.m. On November 17th, I returned to the hospital at 2 p.m. for my scheduled shift. I checked on the patient. The incision had remained open. No further separation had occurred, but the wound had not healed or reapproximated. I reviewed the operative note from the previous day. Dr. Halstead had documented the procedure thoroughly, including the multiple closure attempts. The note listed the surgical team, Dr. Halstead as attending surgeon, myself as first assistant, and a name I did not recognize as second assistant, E. Sevard. We had no second assistant during the case. The surgical team had consisted of Dr. Halstead, myself, the scrub nurse, and the circulating nurse. No additional assistant was present. I checked the staffing records. No one named E. Sevard was employed at the hospital. I asked Dr. Halstead about the name. He said he had not added a second assistant to the operative note. He showed me his documentation. On his copy, the surgical team listed only himself and me. But on my copy and on the official hospital record, E. Sevard appeared as second assistant. I searched the name online. Sevard is Graves, spelled backward. E. Sevard, a reversed version of my name, Ethan Graves. On November 18th, I was assigned to assist Dr. Nyland with a colon resection in OR 2. Routine case, no complications. I performed the bowel anastomosis and closed the fascial and skin layers. At 5:32 p.m., the patient was transferred to the surgical ward in stable condition. At 7:10 p.m., the incision opened. The nursing staff found the wound separated, clean edges, sutures intact. I returned to examine it. The dehiscence was identical to the hernia repair patient. Precise separation, no trauma, sutures undisturbed. I checked the operative note. E. Sevard was listed as second assistant. Again, no such person had been present. I reclosed the wound. At 8:45 p.m., it opened again. I began tracking every case I assisted with. Over the next week, 7 patients experienced unexplained wound dehiscence following my closures. Each incision opened within hours of surgery. Each operative note listed E. Sevard as a phantom second assistant. I reported the pattern to the hospital's surgical quality committee. They reviewed the cases, consulted wound care specialists, and analyzed my technique. They found no fault with my surgical performance. They could not explain the repeated failures. On November 24th, I was asked to review surveillance footage from the OR during one of the affected cases. The committee wanted to verify that no unrecorded individual had interfered with the closures. I watched the footage from the November 18th colon resection. I saw myself performing the closure. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. I placed each suture carefully, approximated the wound edges, and tied the knots securely. But as I watched, I noticed a second pair of hands in the frame working opposite me. The hands were placing sutures simultaneously with mine, using an identical technique. The hands belonged to someone standing where no one had been during the actual surgery. I rewound the footage. The phantom hands appeared intermittently, overlaying my movements, sometimes synchronizing with my actions, sometimes working independently. The hands were mine. The shape, the scars on the knuckles, the way the fingers held the needle driver, all matched my own hands precisely. I was watching myself assist myself in performing closures that would fail. I reviewed footage from other cases. In each video, the phantom second assistant appeared, always positioned opposite me, always using my hands, always performing actions that mirrored or slightly diverged from my own. I consulted with the surveillance technician. I asked if the footage showed any evidence of editing or duplication. He analyzed the video files. The metadata was clean. The footage was unedited and continuous. The phantom assistant was recorded as part of the original surgery. On November 27th, I worked an inguinal hernia repair in OR6. As I closed the incision, I felt a subtle resistance, as though someone else was holding the tissue in tension opposite me. I looked across the surgical field. No one was there. But the sensation persisted. I placed a suture. As I tied the knot, I felt the tissue shift slightly, as though another hand was adjusting the tension differently than I intended. I finished the closure. The wound looked perfect, but I suspected it would fail. At 9:20 p.m., the incision opened. I examined it immediately. The wound edges showed two distinct patterns of suture marks. One pattern corresponded to my technique: evenly spaced, consistent depth, uniform tension. The second pattern was similar but subtly different: slightly closer spacing, marginally deeper bites, fractionally increased tension. Two different assistants had closed the same wound simultaneously, using nearly identical but incompatible techniques. The tissue could not maintain both closures. It resolved the conflict by failing. I began suspecting that E. Sevard was not a phantom assistant, but an alternate version of myself existing in the OR simultaneously, performing closures that interfered with my own. On December 1st, I requested a personal leave of absence. I told the surgical director I needed time to address a health concern. He approved 3 weeks of leave. I did not return after 3 weeks. I contacted the director and requested an extension. He asked when I would be able to return to work. I said I was uncertain. He informed me that my absence was creating staffing challenges. He said another surgical assistant had been covering my cases. He provided the name: Ethan Sevard. I told him no one by that name worked at the hospital. He insisted Sevard had been hired temporarily to cover my leave. I checked the hospital's online staff directory. Ethan Sevard was listed as a surgical assistant hired on December 2nd. The profile photo showed someone who resembled me closely. Same build, similar facial features, but subtly different. The reversed version. On December 7th, I returned to the hospital without authorization. I went to OR6, where Sevard was reportedly assisting with a case. I observed through the window. I saw myself at the surgical table closing an incision. But I was also standing outside watching. The version of me inside the OR completed the closure. The surgeon inspected it and approved. The patient was prepared for transfer. I waited. At the expected time, a nurse paged the surgical assistant to the PACU. The incision had opened. The version of me inside the OR went to examine the dehiscence. I followed at a distance. In the PACU, the other me examined the open wound. I approached and stood beside him. He did not acknowledge my presence. He appeared unaware I was there. I spoke. I said, "You are E. Sevarg." He turned toward me. His expression was blank, uncomprehending. He looked through me as though I were not present. I realized he could not see me. To him, I was the phantom. I was the one interfering with his closures, creating the alternate suture patterns, causing the wounds to fail. I reached toward the wound to examine it. My hand passed through his hand. We occupied the same space but could not interact. I am both Ethan Graves and E. Sevarg, existing in overlapping realities, performing simultaneous closures that cannot coexist. Each version believes the other is the error, the interference, the cause of failure. I no longer attempt to close incisions. I exist in the spaces between surgeries, in the moments after closure and before dehiscence, in the records that list 2 assistants where only 1 should be. Some wounds cannot hold because they are closed by hands that exist in incompatible versions of the same moment. And some surgical assistants learn that every closure they perform is simultaneously being undone by a reversed version of themselves, working with identical skill toward opposite outcomes. The incisions will continue opening, the phantom assistant will continue appearing, and I will continue watching myself fail, unable to determine which version is real and which is the reflection performing closures that only exist to come undone.